Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tina and I am the Capability Building Coordinator for Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar today, which is for leveraging the cloud with Microsoft Azure, which will be presented by Matt Walton from Infoxchange. We'll start with a bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any questions during the session, please type it in the questions box on your webinar panel and Matt will answer them at the end of the webinar. Please note that your comments and questions will not appear to the entire group. If you have any technical issues, please also type it in the questions box and I will try my best to help you out with any issues that may come up. Please note that if you are on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video of the webinar. If possible, please close all other programs to help you have the best experience possible today. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to you all within a week after the webinar ends. You will then be able to access it at any time that you need to. So that's all from me for now. I'll pass it over to Matt.
Thanks, Tina, and welcome everyone to today's webinar on leveraging the cloud with Microsoft Azure. So it is an exciting time in technology with all these new products and new platforms becoming more and more accessible and available to not-for-profits. So Microsoft Azure is one of those, and I'm hoping by the end of today you'll have a good sense of how it could help your organization and solve some of your IT problems. So just as a bit of background and context, Infoxchange are a not-for-profit organization and we only help other not-for-profits use technology better. So in the technology space, we are a Microsoft Gold partner and we do work with a range of not-for-profits. You can see there's some very small ones, there's some very large ones. And I think the key to remember throughout all of this is there's no one size fits all with technology, and each solution is different for each client. So again, hopefully today I'll give you a few different examples. I'll talk both about the non-technical side and the reasons why. I'll touch on some of the practical stuff around how you use Azure and touch on some of the technical stuff. But hopefully there won't be too much jargon in here today, and that both non-technical and technical people should be able to get something out of today and get the sense of how Azure could work for you. So we're going to use our experience with these clients to try and help inform you about how this could work. So when we're talking about any type of technology or any technical solution, we always need to think back is what are our challenges? What problem are we trying to solve with this technology? It's very easy to get excited about new tools and go off and try them and use, have a little play. But it's always important to come back and go, why are we trying this? What are we trying to solve? So essentially, one of the most common things that I get asked, and the common issue with a lot of people's current technology solutions, are that mobility factor. So how do we get our staff who are visiting in clients' homes or working from their own homes, how do we get them to access our systems and information, whether that be our documents on a file server or an application hosted on a server as well? So that's one of the common challenges that we're seeing in the sector, and it's becoming easier and easier to solve that. The other one is obviously cost. So it's getting harder and harder to find funding, and not-for-profits are always sensitive around cost effectiveness. So we need to find things that are both good quality but also good value. So we don't just want to go and spend a lot of money on top of the line systems, where a lot of the time the mid-range or even the free systems can solve our problems. So that's another thing that we always see. And that consistent funding. So in the old model, you used to have to go and ask for money as a once-off investment, so a capital upgrade of servers and software and those sort of things, whereas now it's more of that monthly operational expense where it's a per user sort of model. So, because finding that money, that 50 grand as a once-off to upgrade all your servers and infrastructure is becoming harder and harder to find. And the last one there in the yellow box is access to affordable resources and knowledge. So most not-for-profits can't afford some really good quality and really knowledgeable IT staff. So most not-for-profits, particularly those under 100 staff, don't employ any IT staff. Maybe they have an external contractor for some support, or maybe they get a consultant in occasionally, but getting those affordable technical resources is really hard. So that means it's even harder to actually find those right solutions if you don't have the knowledge or the technical resources. So when we talk about IT and how it should be and what are the goals for IT, when you're designing your IT solution, what are the things that you need to plan for and think about? And the thing that I always tell my clients is that IT should help you achieve your mission. So a lot of time IT becomes an expense item or sometimes a barrier to actually doing what you're trying to do from a service delivery perspective. But what we're really trying to focus on is, say, IT should be an enabler, and it should really allow you to achieve what you want to achieve. So to do that, these are some of the key things. So making sure it's flexible. So making sure it can scale up and down with your organization, and also give you the diversity to be able to change when you want to change. So every time you want to try something new, you want to manage a new project, or you've got some new funding, your IT should be able to help you manage that, not get in the way and stop you from doing these new things. The other one is about business processes. So making sure you're more efficient and you have the information at hand when you want to make that decision. So that's the dashboards that can display your information, or really streamlining those things that are creating manual handling or double entry, which is quite common in not-for-profits. And the last one that we're getting a lot more inquiries about is business continuity and security. So gone are the days where you can survive a couple of days without technology if your server goes down or you have some issue with your building. Now you need access to your technology essentially from anywhere all the time, because most staff are reliant on that for their day-to-day work. And with the new legislation around data breach and ISO 2700, and there's a range of other things that a lot of not-for-profits are wanting to have a stronger focus on security. So they're the things that you need to think about when designing your technical solution. And what we find is, to move to the cloud, these are some of the things that help organizations build the business case. So as we're trying to solve those problems, what we're actually finding is it's more and more reason to move to cloud-based applications like Azure. So one of the most common ones is, my server's 5 years old, it's getting poor reliability, it needs an upgrade, what should I do? And usually the costs associated with moving to the cloud are often better than buying a whole new server, installing software, getting people to come in and build it for you, coming on site, having backups, all of those sort of things, and then managing it and supporting it on an ongoing basis and replacing it every 3 to 5 years. So that's often one of the good reasons for moving to the cloud. The other one is around scalability and flexibility. As I mentioned, it gives you a broader ability to just run up new servers or new systems when you need to. So Azure, essentially, it takes about 10 minutes to run up a new server if you have the need. Likewise, these per month sort of systems, you can add 100 new staff into a new application reasonably easily by just importing a CSV or adding new staff manually, as opposed to if you in the old server model, you'd need to go out and buy the hardware, buy the software, install it, and it takes a lot of time and effort to get those things, and it can often, as we said, be a bit of a barrier. But one of the things that most of the IT people in the webinar will be interested to hear is around the defending against the hardware failure. So not keeping you up at night worrying about whether the backups have worked, and running a patch and worrying about whether the server comes back online every time you reboot it. Those sort of things you don't have to worry about anymore. But from a user perspective, having everything in that one location, where that's that single source of truth, where staff can work on things together, really just improves that ability to collaborate and increase efficiency. So a lot of the time it actually saves you traveling and moving, having to be in the same room and saving different versions and all of those things. You can actually just work in the one location from anywhere and have multiple people doing it. And that really gives you that flexibility and travel costs. So, I worked from home the other day just because I needed to get some writing done. And it just gives you that flexibility. Or I work on the plane, or I work, you basically work wherever you are. The cloud gives you that flexibility. So when you're planning to move to the cloud or exploring systems like Azure, really it comes back to what are your requirements? So what are the things that you need to do as a not-for-profit? How do you use technology? And I'm not going to talk through each of these, but I just wanted to throw a few up there as a bit of a prompter to go, these are things, everything on this page, most of them will be familiar to you: email, telephony, client management systems, reporting, website, e-newsletter. All of these things need some form of solution. Now, the solutions could be anything from cloud to server to a combination of both, to software as a service, to whatever it may be, or to manual. But as long as you're thinking about what are my requirements, what do I actually need? Yes, I need a finance system. Yes, I need an intranet. Yes, I need video conferencing. And then for each of those requirements, we need to come up with that solution. And that's really the first job before you even get bogged down in Azure versus servers versus Office 365 versus Amazon versus whatever. It's really being clear about what you need and how these things talk together. So what the key things that we're talking about is the two different models. So the model, which again, I used to do this model when I was the CIO of a large not-for-profit, national not-for-profit. We owned our own servers and we hosted it in a data center, and we managed them because at the time that was the best solution for that organization. It's becoming a lot easier now to move to the cloud, but back under that scenario, we had to maintain those. So we had to do those monthly reboots and patching and all of those things. We had to install the upgrades every year or 3 years, however often they were. We had to have our own in-house IT team, as well as we had external contractors as well that helped us. And we had limited scalability. So as I've already mentioned, every time we needed a new server or added on an extra couple of hundred staff, we said, okay, we need to go buy a new server, go scope it out, submit an application to the board for capital, do the installation, and then manage that on an ongoing basis. And then we had all of our servers in the one environment. Then we needed a disaster recovery plan. What happened if that data center went down? We needed a secondary data center, and we needed a whole other business continuity plan around what do we do if those servers go down. So in many cases, we had two servers running the same function as a bit of redundancy. And even with all of that, the uptime requirements, we really struggled. Like by the time you do monthly maintenance and have the occasional outage, your uptime can be quite poor when you're managing it yourself, in comparison to what Microsoft and the others guarantee you with platforms like Azure. So that's what many of the not-for-profits are still doing. So a lot of people have them hosted by a third party or in a data center and managing it themselves. A lot of people have the good old box under your desk or in the office, or in the little cupboard in the office running the server, the file server, and those sort of things. So they're the things you need to think about when you own the technology. But with this new cloud-based model, you're essentially outsourcing a lot of that for you. So you're essentially trying to get that reliability. So as we said, Microsoft offer a 99.9% guarantee service levels, and they actually can give you refunds if they don't meet that. So that's one of the key things. It's that peace of mind to know that it's pretty reliable. And they're doing a lot of those backups for you. Obviously, you can still do your own backups and keep stuff locally if you need to, but a lot of the time they just look after that. You don't need to have to worry about tape drives and taking the tapes off for offsite storage and then recalling the tapes and all of that sort of stuff. It's often all built into the system. Security compliance, so they're the ones thinking about all the different types of security. So the physical security to the building, the security to the data, things like firewalls and antivirus and malware, anti-malware, and all of those things. So they're the ones with ISO compliance around information security and all of that. So let them worry about that. And the more important thing is it's always up to date. So instead of having to do that upgrade every few years, you just always get the latest version. Whatever the latest, Windows Server version is, that's what you get. And it's enterprise quality service. So they have banks and banks of these brand new servers, and they, if one goes down, they just move to the next one. So there is that redundancy, but the quality is much better than what we could afford as not-for-profits to put in our office. And with it, as I mentioned, with expandability and scalability, essentially if you want more server capability or horsepower, you essentially just run it up, you apply through an online portal, and it's there, it's ready for you. And the other good bit is you only pay for what you need. So if you need 8 gig, 8 gigs all you pay for. Whereas in the old environment, you went off and bought a server, and if you only use 10% of that server, bad luck, you're wasting 90% of the server. Whereas in Azure and these cloud-based environments, you just pay for what you need basically, and the rates are actually on I think it's a daily or hourly in some cases rate, where you just basically pay per the hour. So if you stop at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that's when your billing stops. So that's a really good value for that. So that's the new model with the cloud-based infrastructure, infrastructure as a service that people like Azure can offer. So just another really quick comparison of the two models, and then we'll get into some detail about Azure. Really, the difference is Azure in the cloud is those ongoing monthly costs. You are relying on the internet, which we'll touch on again later, around making sure you are network connected. So without the internet, you are, or with poor internet, you're going to struggle to access information in Azure. But it is externally hosted, someone else manages the updates, all the software and hardware is combined. So you don't actually have to buy the hardware and then buy the software. When you get a server in Azure, it already comes with Windows Server, so you don't need to go off and buy that separately. You might want to consider offline access. So depending on your location and how good your quality is around your network, what you do if Azure does go down or your network does go down. So that's something to think about. But the great and generous thing that Microsoft are doing also is they're giving all not-for-profits a $5,000 credit every year to use for Microsoft Azure. So many of you could try this essentially for free. So a lot of our clients can get away with using, not actually using Azure and not actually paying for it because they're using underneath that credit limit. Others need more, so they pay on top of that credit limit. So that's the cloud Microsoft Azure model. The infrastructure model is that initial upfront capital purchase. You are relying on a local network, so obviously it's going to be better if your people are in the office, and you have limitations with getting access via VPNs and those sort of things from outside the office. Everything's stored locally, but you do require that ongoing maintenance and offsite backups. You do have to purchase the software and hardware and installation all separately. But you can also get your donated software. So connecting up, you can buy a lot of those licenses through connecting up, whether it's Windows Server and those sort of things. So they're the two different models. As far as what we're seeing in the sector, we are moving gradually. So probably 10 years ago or even more, to be honest, everything was just, you'd have one physical server performing one function. And probably 10 years ago, the Hyper-V and VMware became more and more common in the not-for-profit sector. So you virtualize. So you might have one physical box, but multiple virtual servers. So that was where people have been headed over the last 10 years. Most not-for-profits have some level of virtualization now, which is great. It gives you that redundancy and uses your hardware capacity better. Most not-for-profits now, particularly ones where we're helping them design the solutions, are moving to what we're calling a hybrid cloud. So you've got a bit of cloud-based and a bit of server-based. And the cloud could be a combination of things like Office 365 or Salesforce or Azure, but they might still have some local servers. But as our networks get better and better, and as the cloud becomes cheaper and cheaper and more functional, we're seeing that most people, most not-for-profits in particular, will move into that almost full cloud-based infrastructure environment. Now, again, I'm not anti-servers or anything. A lot of our clients have servers, and it's all fit for purpose. But that's what we're seeing in the sector, is that gradual move to the cloud. And one of the ways that we're seeing people do that is through the Microsoft Cloud Platform. So obviously this webinar is going to be focused on Azure, so the rest of this webinar is really going to get into a bit more detail around the Microsoft Azure platform. Now, if you've heard or logged into any of the Microsoft sessions, they call it Azure. But today I'll call it Azure. So Microsoft Azure, it's the technology platform that allows you to essentially build a server on the cloud and pay as you go. So essentially what you do, instead of buying a big box and installing something on it and then building it, essentially you log on to the portal and then decide what you want and build it online. And you can use that in a range of different ways. So I've listed a couple there, and we'll go into a bit more detail soon. But essentially what it means is that you can go and buy this, get all this great technology without having to, have IT staff to manage it or servers to run it. So really what it means is you can use that $5,000 or that paid service to run up some IT infrastructure that you can use either instead or as well as your on-premise servers. Most people will ask, I'm sure there may even be questions already about where this is. Essentially, there's a data center in Sydney and a data center in Melbourne. So you can have all your data stored in Australia, and you can actually choose where your data lives. It's a very flexible platform, and it allows you to do a whole heap of stuff. So basically anything you can do on a server, on a physical server, you can do on Azure. plus a whole heap more. Essentially, you do need to access it over the internet, and you do need some secure connection into it. So whether it's you need a router or a VPN to get into Microsoft Azure from your office. So there's a whole heap of stuff that you can do with Microsoft Azure, and don't feel bad if you don't know what all of those things are. It just means that it doesn't matter, and you don't need that in many cases. So most not-for-profits won't need most of these things. So essentially, these things are growing every day as well, and we'll touch on the roadmap soon. But essentially, Microsoft keep just putting these great new services online for anyone to buy and use, or improving the capabilities of Azure so that it gives IT professionals more flexibility to be able to build things on Azure. So there's a whole heap of things there. I won't go through each one, but there's just some examples there. What I thought I'd rather focus on is what are the common things. So these are essentially the top 5 things that we're seeing and we're helping not-for-profits use Microsoft Azure for. So really the main one is server hosting. So we have several clients. You essentially, instead of having a local server that does domain controller, file archives, even print, group policy, those sort of things that many of you do local server hosting for, you can essentially build that in Microsoft Azure. So that's a very common one. The other one is backups. So if you've got a local server and you still need a local server, as a minimum, you should be backing it up to the cloud. So Microsoft has some great backup solutions that you can use as a service and store that data in the cloud and use your free $5,000 credit to pay for that storage. So essentially you're getting free cloud backups, which is a great thing for most not-for-profits who particularly don't want to keep having to do those, take the drives off site and change the USB drives every night. The next level of that up is business continuity and disaster recovery. So we have many clients who are exploring these options or using these options to essentially say, if our main location or if our office goes down, either from a network perspective or we have a fire or a flood or whatever it might be in the office, let's run up our server environment in Microsoft Azure and access it from another location, a secondary office or wherever it may be. So they have these options to essentially store your backups in Microsoft Azure, and then if you need to, you restore those backups online and provide access to your users from another location. So that's a really exciting option. Well, we've got a lot of not-for-profit boards asking for these sort of disaster recovery, business continuity solutions, and Azure is a pretty easy, cost-effective way to do that. The other one is just hosting websites and applications. So a lot of people have, whether they're WordPress websites or some form of website hosting on your local server, which can be a risk, or paying an external provider to host your server for you. So again, from a cost effectiveness, if you can use your $5,000 credit to save some money on website hosting, then you can use that money for something else. The same with applications. So if for some reason you do need a server-based application, as opposed to a cloud-based application like Salesforce or Office 365 or whatever it may be, you can host that application on Microsoft Azure. So they're some of the most popular ones in terms of what you can use Microsoft Azure for. So hopefully that will tweak something in you to say, oh yeah, I need that, or that's something that will help my organization. So really, although it comes back to requirements, go back to what do you actually need as an organization, and then find the solution and hopefully leverage something like Microsoft Azure. The one thing I wanted to try and convey and get people to understand is the cloud has various different options and various different solutions. So the cloud is not just one thing. The cloud is multiple models. And the three there, the red box, the green box, and the blue box, are three that I want you to try and understand. So SaaS is software as a service. So as it said there in the red box, move in, it's ready. So this is something that Microsoft's already built for you, basically, or in some cases built the platform and then you can build on top of it. Essentially, they're ready to pick up and use. So Office 365 is a good example where it's actually a software as a service. You just register or subscribe or buy or get it for free, and you just start using it. So that's what we mean by software as a service. And the non-Microsoft options are things like Salesforce, Facebook, Google, Gmail, and those sort of things. So you can just get Yammer, OneDrive, Dynamics, even the Azure backup that I mentioned. It's a service that you just essentially buy. So that's a move in and ready, and you shouldn't require too much technical expertise to help you get that up and running. You don't need developers or anything like that. The next one is platform as a service. So that's that PaaS in the green. And what that means, it's some assembly required. So the example is wanting a server in Microsoft Azure. So essentially you log onto the Azure portal and you start building the server. So to do that though, you need to know how to build a server. So it's a lot simpler than doing it in real life. But for example, I personally don't go in and build servers in Azure. I get our engineers to do that. So you might need some more technical expertise to do that. And there's a bit more flexibility. So you can set that up however you want. So that for your SQL database, you can configure your SQL database however you want, or install your applications, or set it up however you want. So that's really that the green option, the platform as a service. It has some restrictions, but generally it's pretty flexible. The other one, the blue one, is infrastructure as a service, where basically Microsoft just gives you the infrastructure and you do whatever you want with it. So you do your storage, or let Microsoft host the back end of the infrastructure. But again, for that one, is more likely to, if you were going to develop something yourself or create something, or a data warehouse, those sort of things, you can build that on Microsoft's infrastructure. So if you're building a mobile app, that's the three different options. So really, when we are thinking about your solutions, have a think about each one of those three models and which one works for you best. I would say most of you would use most of your applications in that software as a service stream, and occasionally you might need a couple in the green platform as a service. I don't expect most of you that aren't IT companies or developing things from scratch would need the infrastructure as a service, but you never know. So the other thing to think about is what you don't need Azure for. So this is stuff that you just go and get directly. So Office 365, so if all you want is email in Office 365, maybe store your documents in OneDrive or SharePoint, you don't actually need Azure for that. If that's all you need and your requirement is email, documents, and maybe some other things in the Office 365 platform, then don't worry about Azure. Ignore that. The same from a non-Microsoft perspective. If you just need an email address and you don't want Office 365, Gmail's fine, or Dropbox for documents. So you don't need to run up a server for those things. They're software as a service. And the same with some of these other applications. So Xero and MyOb, most of you host your finance systems online now. So you don't, in the old days, you actually needed a server to install MyOb or Reckon or QuickBooks, but you don't need that anymore. So in most cases, most of our, not our not-for-profits, use Xero or MyOb or one of those cloud-based ones. When you're getting into more complex or more sort of advanced finance systems like Tech One or Dynamics Navision, then they can either be installed on your servers or a hosted environment. So you might need service for that. If you're looking at Dynamics Navision, you can go down that path. Although Microsoft are now launching Dynamics 365, which is another cloud-based finance system. The same with websites. So you used to, have to host your own WordPress websites or other types of websites, but now you can essentially just go online, go to the Squarespace website and go, register, give me a website, use their templates and pay a monthly fee. And WordPress have a hosting option as well. So you can essentially, you don't need Azure for that. However, if you have some really custom requirements or you really want to host it yourself, then you can host a website on Azure. Same with client management. So there's a lot out there, supportability, SRS, they're all cloud-based, or, for example, Infoxchange hosts SRS. We host that in our servers in Port Melbourne, and we look after all of that for you. So you just log into a web browser and access that there. So you don't need to worry about Azure for that. Whereas some of the other more server-based, CareLink Plus is a good example, where even though they're now offering a hosted option as well, I believe, you could run up your own CareLink server in Azure and access it there. Similarly with CRM, Salesforce, Dynamics CRM online, that's all just hosted online, don't need Azure again. And the same with MailChimp or a lot of those social media ones like Facebook or Instagram. So I hope that at least has given you a sense to go, actually, what I thought I needed some web hosting for, I could actually just go to Squarespace or something like that to solve that problem. And the other one that I've mentioned a couple of times is that often someone else hosting it is a good solution as well. So CareLink Plus does need to be installed on a server, but other people, you can pay other people to manage that if that is the right solution. So pay the people who run CareLink Plus to host that solution for you, even though it is on a Windows server. So there's some of the things you don't need it for. So coming back to those few different options, just to clarify the I suppose, design. The first column there is local server infrastructure. So again, this is the sort of older model, whereas it's still suitable for some of our clients. If you need a local server, you need Windows Server 2012 on it. You have an Active Directory and domain controller, and to get files from home, you need a VPN connected from your laptop into your local server. You keep all the server storage locally. You probably need offsite backups, but everything's local. And that solution is very familiar to a lot of people. So that's why a lot of the time if you have a small local IT provider, they're very familiar with these solutions and they've been doing them for a long time. So often that's the option that you get proposed first when you ask a small provider that's maybe not as across the cloud-based or Azure scenarios. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind as well when you're assessing solutions, is each IT provider has a preference, and you need to make sure that their preference and your requirements do match. So that's another thing to think of. If you've got a local server, obviously you're not as reliant on the internet if people are in your office and accessing files. So for some of our clients where they have poor connectivity or very expensive connectivity in regional areas, sometimes that local file server is a good idea. But for a lot of our city people or people wanting access remotely, it is difficult to access in many cases. All the information and files and those sort of things from a file server stored in an office when you're trying to work from home or from a client site. And that server does require management, backups, air conditioning, patching, upgrades, all of those sort of things. So that's one scenario. The second scenario there is the public cloud. So a lot of people can just rely on this Salesforce, Dynamics 0, Office 365. So a lot of our clients are actually cloud only. They don't have a server. Everything they have is software as a service, and they just pay per the user, and they let each vendor manage that for them. You generally don't have control over the data storage. Now, a lot of them are in Australia now, but not all. And it's often an expensive option to either get onto these systems or on an ongoing basis. But most have not-for-profit pricing. Even Salesforce have not-for-profit deals. The other one is the hosted Azure infrastructure. So as I mentioned, a lot of our clients are doing more and more of this in terms of running up a server in Azure and using it for SQL or remote desktop application access or domain controller or whatever it may be. You manage the data storage, which could be in Melbourne and Sydney, and you pay that fixed rate per storage. There can be costs involved. So if, particularly with resource intensive applications like SQL, it can get expensive if you're paying on a monthly basis for hosting these things. Obviously you've got your $5,000 credit, but you need to sort of do the sums to work out whether that's going to be enough for you over the course of a year. And then there's the web apps or the hosted Azure infrastructure as a service. So essentially you can use Azure's templates and essentially buy the service. But often if you're doing that, like if you're hosting or developing a website, then there's development costs up on Azure compared to if you're doing Squarespace, for example. So they're just a few of the different options for hosting your applications and your infrastructure. So again, all of these are designed to give you a bit of a sense of what's suitable for you. One of the questions we get asked a lot is, is my internet going to be sufficient to move into the cloud? And unfortunately, there's no yes or no answer. It just depends on what you're using it for, what you're accessing, how many people, what quality of internet, what types of data you're putting over your internet. So hopefully this table gives you 3 examples. So, if you've got a small office of 5 staff wanting to host Azure on a server, I think you might struggle on ADSL. Now, if you didn't want Azure and you just wanted email and maybe some documents in Office 365, you could maybe get away with it. But if you're wanting to have a local server in Azure or an application hosted on Azure and VPN up to that server, as well as that cloud-hosted application for finance or Salesforce or whatever it may be, your performance is going to struggle. So what we're generally seeing is ADSL is not suitable for most not-for-profits moving forward in a very cloud-based environment in the future. Now, not saying you can't get away with it, but it's not preparing you for the future. So many people are waiting for the NBN, which can solve some of the problems, but not all. Others are moving to those next level, which is the next example there, which is those Ethernet connections, which are the synchronous 2020. So 20 meg upload, 20 meg download is a good example of an Ethernet connection. And so if you've got that upload and download, it means you can have the data going backwards and forwards. So it means that you can use something like SharePoint where you go upload and download data. It means you can access a cloud-hosted client management system like, again, Dynamics Salesforce, as well as your finance system Xero. And for many organizations, if you want a domain controller and maybe a file archive, a hosted server in Azure is fine. But you do need that managed VPN on a high-grade router. So having that 2020 connection should allow you to maintain that ongoing VPN, site-to-site VPN, to make it easier to push data back and forwards for your Azure domain controller. Now you notice I didn't mention file server. Now, particularly on a 2020 connection, or probably on a 100 connection, I don't actually recommend that you store a file server in Azure and try and just treat it as a normal file server. The performance and the lag can be frustrating. So unless you've got a really brilliant, 500 meg connection and small files or small files, you're probably not going to have as great an experience using a file server all day, every day, if it's hosted in Azure, compared to what it was like in the office just through the blue cable next to you. So remember, you are going up and down the internet every time you're doing something on Azure, so you need to be a little bit careful of that. So when we're talking about larger organizations, 100 staff, then particularly if a lot of them are in the one location, so if you've got more than 50 in one location, we're generally saying the minimum is 100 fiber connection, which is becoming more and more easily accessible in Metro Melbourne now, and Sydney and Brisbane and Adelaide. So that should be sufficient for things like email and intranet. You might still need a local file server for some reasons if you've got a lot of large videos that you're doing editing on. But the other good thing about having an Azure environment for a multi-site organization is you can access everything online from multiple locations. And particularly if you're hosting your phone system and you're wanting good quality voice and you're wanting to manage quality of service over that connection, 100 or even more if you can. Again, it's all that balance of cost versus benefit. And the other thing is, if you've got some remote locations or some small offices running off 4G or ADSL, then they're the ones that will struggle with the performance. So your 100 at your main office should be fine for most of those stuff. But if you've got some remote offices using 4G or ADSL that can't get those good quality connections, then they're the ones who need to manage the expectations around quality of those services. All right, so I wanted to give you a bit of a case study on just one example of a national not-for-profit using Azure. So this is one, they've got over 100 staff that in multiple offices. They had a really strong preference for not having server infrastructure. So they had some bad experiences with servers in the past, so they wanted a full cloud-based application. And because they weren't in, their head office wasn't in one spot, if they did have a server, they couldn't decide where to put it. So so the idea was go full cloud-based and make it accessible from all of their offices and their mobile workforce. So most of them moved to laptops, but most of their systems were all cloud-based. So Salesforce for their CRM and Office 365 for their documents and email and video conferencing and those sort of things. But they did need, because they had 100 PCs, they did need that central management of their domain and their PCs and group policy, print management, storage of archives, those sort of things. So essentially what we recommended was, let's use Microsoft Azure, and we implemented and we ran up multiple servers on Azure for domain controller, storage of file archives, backups, and a site-to-site VPN. So here's a bit of a diagram of that. Now again, I'm not, hopefully it's not too technical, but essentially we did run AAD Connect to synchronize the usernames and passwords between the file server in Azure, the domain controller in Azure and Office 365. And we made sure there was an Azure supported router in each of those locations and a good 100 meg connection in both the main offices. But people could still access it remotely if they needed to. But most of the time, when the people were out and about, they actually just used Salesforce and Office 365. So they actually didn't need to come into Azure unless they were in the office and trying to print or access the file archive or access group policies. So they were some of the key ones. So we set up the VPN between all those locations, got good connection, and essentially in the Azure data center, they're running 2 virtual servers. that they're paying for on a monthly basis. So I wanted to give you a sense of cost as well for Azure. So as we said, you all get $5,000 credit, but in this scenario, they're actually using more than their credit. But they're still only paying $3,000, which is reasonably cost efficient if you think of, the other alternative of buying a server, installing software, doing backups, and managing that on an ongoing basis. So they decided that that cost was worth it. And these costs change all the time as well. So don't assume this is exactly what you will pay, or even since I've worked on this slide, they've probably changed. So, but these are some examples. So 2 servers cost about $420 a month. So often that's a good rule of thumb, depending on the size and scale of the servers and how much RAM and disk space you need. And also how many hours there are in a month. So, as we said, it charged that month is 744 hours. In February, it might only be 600 hours. So you're going to pay less that month. And there's also often charges for the traffic of going in and out. So if they did some massive downloads one month, then it might be more expensive. Microsoft do give you support though. So there's $36 there where they can actually call Microsoft directly. So and that can often save you money on your IT provider as well. So I hope that gives you a bit of a sense on cost and how that can work. Obviously each service, the backups, the site recovery, the web hosting, they're all different costs, but there's a pretty easy calculator where even non-technical people can go and run that up. So essentially when you go to build a server or even get your quote, this is the type of thing that you can look at. So you essentially choose all your different options, including where you want it to be hosted. And then from there, you essentially choose how much storage, whether you need VM, what type of virtual machine, even what software is installed on it, and you basically pick, all the different options. Now, this is where I suppose the next one in particular is where it gets a little bit technical, and why I get my engineers to do it, to make sure all the settings are right and all the machine sizings are right. Make sure you've got the right amount of RAM and the IP addresses are right and all of those sort of things, diagnostics. So it's still a reasonably easy configuration. So essentially you go in, you build your server here, which is easier than building it on the server if you bought it and the Windows operating system. So that's generally the process for getting these things set up. So to get in there, and again, I think this has actually changed recently as well, but essentially, if you've got Office 365 already, which most of you do, I believe, then it's actually easier to do that through your Office 365 Admin Center, because you want to make sure that your Azure and your Office 365 are linked together. You don't want to do them both separately and then try and link them later. It's a bit more complicated. So do that through your Admin Center. There is a validation process that there used to be tokens that you had to put in. I actually think that's changed slightly just recently, but essentially there's, you can go to those links and try and log on. That eligibility, the NGO home, will allow you to do that. Essentially, the Microsoft not-for-profit portal will allow you to do that. And using your Office 365 admin, activate those links and access the credit. You can get help from Microsoft. So you can, particularly with those with Office 365, you can just log a support ticket through your tenant, and the technical people can help you do that. And then the Azure portal is portal.azure.com. So the other thing to have a look at is just keep an eye on the roadmap. So there's a link there. These things are changing all the time, and there's so many things in Azure coming. But for those, particularly the technical people who want to dig into the detail, have a look at the roadmap and see what's coming. There's a lot of technical stuff around APIs and security and applications and hosting, but there might be something in there that's relevant for your organization. So keep an eye on that. It is something Microsoft are investing a lot of money in continually building. So just wrapping up, conscious we've got 5 minutes to go, and I do want to try and save some time for questions. These are some of the things to think about before you move to Azure. Now, again, this is only an hour webinar, so we couldn't cover everything, but really, even before you move to Azure, I would say, does the system have a hosted option? So if you've got an Exchange server in your environment, I wouldn't move that to Azure. I would go to Exchange Online through Office 365, which you don't need Azure for. Same with things like MyOb or Dynamics. So I'd explore those options first and often compare the cost. Usually things like MyOb Online are actually cheaper than hosting a MyOb server yourself, or the same with Office 365. It's cheaper to go to the free Exchange Online than to host an Exchange server in Azure. The other one is double check that what you're trying to do is compatible with Azure and that it will work up there. If it's a really old version of, you've got Server 2003, an application sitting on that and you're wanting to move it up, you might struggle with some of that compatibility stuff. So that's something that I would check. And likewise with your routers, don't assume that your current old router would allow you to connect a VPN into Azure. There's a link there to check which devices. And worst case, you just upgrade your router for that. The biggest one and the often the most expensive one is the internet connection. So don't assume you can just put all of your local servers up into Azure and then access it via an ADSL connection or a really poor connection, because you're gonna, and maybe you can get it up there, but maybe you're gonna have a very bad experience. And then the cost of that internet connection on an ongoing basis. Are you eligible for the $5,000 credit? Now, if you're eligible for the free Office 365 E1s, then I can almost guarantee that you're eligible for the $5,000 credit. But obviously double check that first with Microsoft and make sure that you can apply that credit to your current tenant before you go off and spend a lot of money in Azure. But really, I would encourage you to sit down, do that double check of what will it cost in Azure versus what will it cost if I buy a new local server. And we've done that. We do that for a lot of our clients. And in some cases, it's actually cheaper to keep a local server. And in some cases, that's a good idea. So do that comparison first. So just wrapping up, the top tips for you to think about when you're designing technology. Now, this doesn't matter if you use Azure or something else. Really, the things you should be thinking of is where will your organization be in 5 years, and how will your staff work? So will you be more mobile? Will you have multiple offices? Or will you just still have 10 people sitting in the one office in Melbourne, in which case a server might be okay. But plan for how that works, where you will be, and then design this technical solution based on that, and then work towards it. Determine your requirements for applications. So really work out what you need first before you go off and sort of just start playing with the cloud-based systems. Understand what you need and confirm which applications will help meet that need. Maybe some of those software as a service like Xero or Office 365 will solve the need and you don't need a server or Azure. Know how your staff need to work. If 90% of your staff are trying to access things remotely with VPNs, I'd probably recommend a different solution to if you're all sitting in one office accessing a file server all day. Don't feel you need to do it all at once. So often it's working out what adds value and do things one at a time. So often people go to Office 365 first, or maybe you just set up a domain controller in Azure first, or backups in Azure first, and then move your websites and other things later when they're about to be redeveloped. And in most cases, a lot of our clients have a bit of both. So a hybrid model, there's nothing wrong with a hybrid model. You can do some local and some cloud-based, and that can work. But some of these platforms can get a little bit technical. So if what you're doing is complex, then I would encourage you to use leverage your local staff or even a board member or a consultant or a support provider who has expertise in the area. And that means if your current support provider doesn't have the expertise, maybe bring someone in just for a short period to do that. And the last one there is really just building that business case. Do that comparison between your local and your hosted and see which one's the best for your organization. So I hope that has helped. And I think, Tina, we've just hit 12. So obviously people can contact me directly. If you email me or send me a message, I can actually get some engineers to talk to you. I can, come up with some answers as well. So feel free to contact me directly or connect via LinkedIn. But if anyone wants to ask some questions, feel free, Tina. I can hang around for a few minutes.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. We actually don't have any questions, but if anybody does have any questions post this session, please feel free to contact Matt directly, or you can contact me on events@connectingup.org. So thank you very much, Matt, for presenting today, and thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that you have learned a lot from today's presentation. As previously stated, please feel free to contact either of us if you have any questions. And don't forget that the recording will be available within the next week, and a link will be sent to you via email. So keep an eye out on your inbox. Again, thank you for being with us and enjoy the rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you all next time. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.
See ya.